Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and so this is kind of exactly what it says on the tin. Mysteries of the Middle Ages by Thomas Cahill, which is book 5 or 6 of the Hinges of History series. Mysteries of the Middle Ages, the Rise of Feminism, Science, and Art from the Cults of Catholic Europe. That's exactly what it's about. One of the most important things that Thomas Cahill points out, and we kind of exist in a post-revolutionary post-changed, revised understanding of the Middle Ages. We kind of exist in a, revised history of that period era. But the Middle Ages, the medieval period, were popularly known as the Dark Ages for a reason. And that reason was fundamentally because, as he points out at the end of the book, you have this period of time between the fall of Rome, which was looked upon during the Renaissance and Enlightenment era as sort of the be-all and end-all of ratiocination and the greatest civilization to ever exist, that you had Rome fall, and then you have the rise of the humanism and the sciences as they appeared in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that followed. That is the period known as the Enlightenment. And that it was usually seen that this era between these 2 points was just a vast morass of life being, unfortunate, brutish, and short, to misquote. But the thing is that what you had in the Middle Ages was, yes, there was a certain degree of loss. That, if the Roman Empire had not collapsed, if they had continued on apace, the fact is we would probably be far more ahead technologically today than we are. Because, yes, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, just masses of learning, were lost in the West. All of the potentialities of the West were lost for centuries because of that. Now, you had advancements that happened in the Far East, in China and Japan. You had the Middle East and the Islamic world, which continued to trundle along quite competently. But the fact of the matter is that when you have any sort of massive, educationally poverty-stricken sector, it drags everyone around it down, because the people coming from that place into other places carry that lack of education with them. People visiting from other places feel a smug sense of complacency that they don't have to do better because they're already better than those guys. So, there's a lot that sort of got messed up by the collapse of the Roman Empire. The thing is, though, that to suggest that there was nothing happening in the Middle Ages except, bloody death and horror is to kind of ignore everything that went on, because the fact is that the humanism of the Renaissance period, all of these things that came out of the Renaissance, developed precisely because you had all of those centuries between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance in which to mitigate aspects of Rome which did get lost, and for those peculiarly Christian-inspired angles of things to sort of take precedence and lead the way. And so, to dismiss the Middle Ages is to just ignore a whole sector of history. But this is something that has been traditionally done, and so you have a lot of books from around the turn of the last century, or rather, the turn of this century, pardon me, that really are specifically talking up the Middle Ages. And what you have in this book is Thomas Cahill talking about the fact that how much of our modern perspective on things was driven by the Catholic Church, which, I mean, in Western Europe was the church. I mean, yes, there were always the Arian heretics, the, you pick your heretics, there were always some floating around, but, you had the first genuine major schism of the church between the Eastern Church, which is now the Orthodox Church, and the Western Church, which is now the Catholic Church. That was the first major schism, and the second one didn't, and that happened starting around the time of Constantine, as he says in this book, because when Constantine decided to make the church the state religion, and then promptly move his capital, the capital of the Roman Empire, from Rome over to what was Byzantium and was later renamed Constantinople and is now Istanbul, as the song goes, that move was the first thing that, it was sort of the first cut, because it created this cultural divide, because the power of the emperor had shifted east and had kind of abandoned a whole bunch of stuff to the west, and so things fell apart even more quickly. And as he rightfully points out and traces, as things fell apart, the only literate people left who could maybe have a grander grasp of things than just immediate local issues tended to be churchmen. And so the church wound up with a great deal of temporal power, precisely because these were the people with the education and the training to handle large regions of territory, and they wound up in significant and powerful advisory positions, and it all gave the church a great deal more power than it would ever have had if not for this. But the thing is that what he points out after that, though, is because the church was such a foundational, central part of life, that it had an impact. It had an impact on feminism because first you have the cult of the Virgin Mary, which is a powerful focus in the Catholic Church on the value and place of the Virgin Mary, of Christ's mother, of Jesus's mother, rather, in sort of the grand scheme of things. And by creating the cult of the Virgin Mary, you have exalted a woman in a very patriarchal society, and having exalted a woman that way, you have abruptly made women so much more important. He brings up Hildegard von Bingen, who was one of the most famous nuns in all of history, who is known as a writer and a composer and a whole bunch of things, and who became incredibly powerful and very, very famous. And she was supposed to be an anchorite, that is, a person who is kind of locked away in a tiny little cell, but instead of being a true anchorite, she became just a leading member of society. And the thing about that is, it gave her power and consequently raised estimations of women. It creates an example for other women to look at and say, we too can be important. We can do important things. Eleanor of Aquitaine who was not religious until apparently the final years of her life, when she finally decided to join a convent, which frankly a lot of women did in the Middle Ages because it was a great way to not be forced to marry and to live in a place where you could read and not, do hard physical labor all the time, and were a respectable member of the community without a man. So, a lot of women went to the church not because they had a vocation, but because it meant intellectual and physical safety. So there's that to be said, but Eleanor of Aquitaine was a powerhouse. She inherited titles because there was no male child to inherit ahead of her, and she is remembered and will always be remembered as just this incredible powerhouse of strength and sense and driving ambition, and again she creates a precedent, a notice in the Middle Ages of that. But the thing about the Middle Ages is that this was in fact a time when women could own businesses, women could do all sorts of things, and of course women always aspired to that most enviable of positions, being a widow. Because being a widow means that you are not only respectable, you are also allowed to go out on your own, so that you have no husband to restrict you, but you remain respectable nonetheless. It was a highly coveted position. It would be great. You marry, like, an old man when you're, 13. By the time he's dead, you're fully adult, and you can do whatever you want. We won't examine the problems with all of those statements, but the thing is that both of those powerhouse things were mitigated and aided and abetted and noted and raised up and commented upon by the church. Science is an obvious one. Science is one of those weird things that the church was in support of it right up until it wasn't. Because the thing about science is that up until science began to actively compete with and declare invalid pieces of the church's beliefs and words that are escaping me right now that will come up to me after I finished recording this, that until those actually challenged the church, the fact of the matter is that science was seen as a way of better understanding God's creation. And so the church would support those who were having various scientific endeavors, so long as they didn't say something that tripped into heresy. And so you have Thomas Aquinas, you have all kinds of people who are discussing philosophy and the sciences through a much more scientific lens, but who are all churchmen or who become churchmen because the church did support it, as I said, right up until they didn't, as, Copernicus and Galileo found out to their dismay. Art is obviously one that was impacted by the church because, of course, the church was always hiring artists to paint in their chapels and churches and to build things and be architects and sculptors. So the church affects it, and of course, so patronage obviously affects it, but it also affects it because all of these subjects, so many of the subjects of painting were Christian subjects, and so you have these things being seen through new lenses, new perspectives, and it feeds back and forth with the church. Now, cults of Catholic Europe is surprisingly obvious because when you think about all of the various groups of all the various monastic orders, they are often very, very cult-like, and I'm running out of time, but just think about the differences between Benedictines and Dominicans and Franciscans, and the origin points of each of these, and you'll see how that becomes a line of cultish thinking. And I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to stop talking about this. That's everything, and I will see you all next week.